So Colin, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
I am really excited to talk to you because you've done a lot to bring information and clarity around not just the differences between the biological sexes, which is being denied at the moment, which we'll get more into, but also the pitfalls and the danger of science denialism itself, which is so important. So could you start us off by just telling us a little bit about how you got into science, what drew you to evolutionary biology, and why science denialism has mattered to you?
Yeah, so I first got into evolution because I was really involved in sort of the new atheist movement back in like the mid 2000s. And I found myself when I was arguing with people like about the existence of God or whatever, a lot of times they'd come at me from a creationist point of view or an intelligent design point of view. And at the time I didn't know much about evolution. I had learned little bits in school here and there, and so I found myself going back to online on websites like Talk Origins and things, and just learning about evolution, and then buying textbooks on evolution just so I could sort of counteract some of the claims that were being made. I wanted to go to the science, and it just completely captivated me. I started reading stuff by like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Gould, and I just kind of became obsessed with evolution. And at the time, I was going the route of being a real estate agent. I actually had my real estate license, and that's what I was doing at the time. But then that was around 2008 when the market just sort of crashed. Like I was a new agent for maybe about a month, and then the market crashed. And so then all of a sudden I couldn't be a real estate agent anymore. And I had dropped out of college before then for having really bad grades. And then I just sort of made a decision that, well, I'm really obsessed with evolutionary biology and I want to go into that. And so I just sort of doubled down, went back to school, and sort of the rest has been history since then. So I've always had this sort of like debunking pseudoscience attitude. That's what I did a lot. I was involved in the atheist movement, but I was also sort of majorly in the skeptic movement too. And I would debunk things like ancient Chinese medicine and these things. I had a blog that I used to run back in the day that I've taken it down now because some of it's kind of cringy. But so that's sort of my history of sort of trying to combat pseudoscience, no matter where it comes from. And while I was in academia, when I went to grad school after my undergrad, I sort of realized that there were some ideas that were sort of sacrosanct on the left as well in academia, such as, the sort of blank slate idea when it comes to behavioral differences between males and females, like everything is a result of socialization. There's no innate genetic differences that are causing any sort of difference in preference between the sexes. And then, that's a claim that you can combat and you can discuss because there are social factors and it's going to be a mix of environment and genetics. And then I just sort of heard people making these more and more bold, ridiculous claims where they were saying things like biological sex itself is a social construct, that it's or it's a spectrum, that you can't talk about there being males or females as discrete categories, but you can only talk about like degrees of maleness and femaleness. And I just thought this was insane. And at first I thought they were talking about gender identity. And then when I probed more, like, no, they're talking about actually like biological sex itself. And so I'd pushed back against this stuff. And whereas before, where I pushed back against creationists and Christians on claims of God, those people just called me, maybe stupid or wrong. But now I was being called a sort of a bigot or a transphobe or a sexist if I was trying to combat some of these new ideas. That caused me to shut up for a while because I was trying to get into grad school. I was trying to be competitive for postdocs and maybe future professor jobs. And it just sort of reached a boiling point where things were getting published in Nature that were denying the reality of biological sex, saying that there's no combination of genetics or anatomy that defines the biological sexes, and this is completely wrong. And so I think I just sort of snapped and I stopped caring whether or not it would affect my career, even though all my advisors were telling me not to, because I thought the truth mattered. And I could see areas in society where this sex denialism was sort of cropping up in ways that were really, really harmful for a lot of vulnerable groups. And I just didn't think I could remain sort of complicit in that thing, that whole area. So I decided to speak up. And it could have gone bad. It ended up working out pretty well for me in the long run, it looks like. But yeah, that's that's how I got to where I am right now, actually. So
When your advisors told you not to speak up, what was that conversation like? Did they say, yeah, you're right, but you shouldn't say it? Did they know that it would damage your prospects?
yeah, so they were both. So I got two things. One, so I had two main mentors, and they were both very supportive, and they agreed with what I was writing. One of them told me that if I publish it, I might want to publish under a pseudonym. Uh, and then another one of my advisors, I guess I'd call him my mentor instead of advisor. He just said, don't even publish this under a pseudonym because someone will trace it back to you somehow, and then you'll be totally screwed. He was just adamant about not publishing this if I wanted to be competitive for jobs, just because it touched on trans issues and gender non-conforming people and non-binary, all this stuff that was just completely radioactive topics. But one other thing they said too was they said, don't do these, or they said don't publish this. But then they also said, you're completely correct, but don't publish this. And to me, that was just like all I needed to hear was you're correct, but don't do that, because that's, the whole reason I got into science in the first place and wanted to be an academic was so I could think freely and combat bad ideas wherever I see them and mentor students and try to just follow evidence wherever it takes me. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm right before the finish line. I'm applying for academic professor jobs, and now I'm being told that I can't state true things that I can argue with tons of facts and evidence. I'm just told to be quiet. And so that was, I didn't want to live that sort of zipper-lipped academic life if that's what I had to do, or I didn't have to choose between academia and free speech and free thought, because I thought those were supposed to be compatible, but that turned out not to be the case.
Yeah, and it's really particularly scary to hear because we hear a lot about how the humanities are overrun by this type of science denialism and this censorship culture, but the hard sciences are really overtaken as well. Is that
Yeah,
true?
there's sort of a generational gap too. I feel like some of the older professors aren't buying onto this, or if they are, they just sort of pay it lip service when people say sex is a spectrum. They'll kind of, you can sort of wrap your head, and there's ways you can contort sort of the facts to be like, in some ways it can be a spectrum. If we're just talking about body shape generally or something, like we can have masculine, more looking women and males that have more feminine body types and things like that. So then there's some sort of basic entry-level understanding where you can kind of be like, oh yeah, it's this sort of an intuitive, yeah, sex is kind of on a spectrum maybe. But when they're actually talking about males and females at a fundamental level, like that's just anything, it's completely not true. And I do see a lot of the younger scientists, a lot of the grad students and postdocs, they do seem to be championing this whole sex spectrum ideology, defaulting to people's gender identity. And it's really concerning because these are the people who are currently gonna, if the grad students and postdocs are a reflection on what the composition of the new professors are going to be in the future, that's really worrying because it's complete pseudoscience that's just pretty rampant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so what is this whole idea about sex as a spectrum or sex as a social construct? Because I've had people, not just on Twitter, in real life, tell me that sex is a social construct. And so why are they saying this?
It's so bizarre. So, I mean, it all basically comes down to they're confusing the existence of intersex individuals. So there's certain individuals out there who have some sort of developmental condition that results in ambiguous genitalia or mixed gonads, and they might present themselves as either, they have an ambiguous looking sex, or their outward appearance of sex might conflict with their internal sexual anatomy. And people point to these certain individuals as evidence that the categories of male and female themselves, since there do appear to be maybe these intermediate individuals, therefore you can't really say that these are categorical differences, that these aren't discrete categories, male and female. And in some way it's just like, okay, well, It's true that there's only two sexes, but then that doesn't follow that, therefore everybody can be completely categorized as 100% male, 100% female. You can have maybe an individual who might be sexually ambiguous, but just because you have sort of these edge cases doesn't mean that almost everyone doesn't fit squarely into one of these other boxes. I usually use like a coin flip analogy for this because you have a coin that has heads and a tails on it, and heads and tails don't really come in degrees or quantities. If you get a heads, it's 100% heads. If you get tails, it's just clearly 100% tails. But with a nickel, anyway, there have been studies where about 1 out of every 5,000 or 6,000 flips will land on its edge. And that's about the same rate that you have intersex conditions come out in people. And so just because, a coin can land on its edge that's neither heads nor tails, doesn't mean that like the categories heads and tails are meaningless or on a spectrum. And that's sort of how to think about males and females. Like most males and females don't come in degrees. They're just clearly male or female. And the existence of some edge cases don't negate the reality of those two categories. So that's sort of one approach to doing, using intersex people to sort of try to blur the boundary. And then another thing they'll do is they'll use the existence of what are called secondary sex characteristics. And these are the changes that the body goes through during puberty and how it's different for males and females. So males will get like more upper body strength. They'll get more square jaws. Their voice will get deeper. They'll grow beards. Females will get, they'll have widening hips and, they'll grow breasts and things like that. And these things are related to sex. Like your sex is going to determine largely how you develop these different traits. But those traits aren't sex itself, is the take-home message. You can have females that have very masculinized feature and have very masculine, faces and have broader shoulders. And you can have some males that maybe didn't get as much testosterone as they were developing, or even have high amounts of, if you have XXY males, sometimes they'll have some breast development or something. That doesn't mean they're no longer male or female. It just means that they're males with certain more feminine body types. And so you get this confusion of primary sexual characteristics, which are your gonads basically, and to a lesser degree your genitals. And those are being confused with the secondary characteristics that are related to sex but aren't really sex itself. So those are the main two arguments that people use to say, try to say that sex is a spectrum or a social construct.
And then there's also this whole language issue, because I've also heard people saying stuff like, male and female are just socially constructed ideas in themselves. So that all of us are assigned a sex at birth rather than just having our sex observed. That's the idea being put forth. And that I guess male and female are just arbitrary concepts applied to something that we've decided as people fits them. What is that? I mean, why? What are they doing to language here?
Yeah, you do get that whole, they like a trans individual usually will say something like, I was assigned male at birth, but that's not how I identify. And when I've actually spoken to people who come from that point of view, they'll use the assigned language, and it's kind of a variation of the intersex argument, because some intersex people are missexed at birth. You can have an individual like Caster Semenya is a good example. She's the South African Olympic runner, sprinter. She does like the 400 meter or something. And, she on her birth certificate says female because she has a condition called 5ARD, which basically prevents like your genitals from forming, the male genitals from forming during, in utero. And so you're born with very feminine looking genitalia. You look like a normal anatomical female. And then later in life, it turns out that they don't get their period, and then sometimes they'll have, their body will actually start developing much more masculine features because they do have internal testes. These individuals are XY. And so you'll get, you can mess up basically on an individual's sex. Some women have androgen insensitivity where they are the male on the inside, but they look like they develop completely like females. So they're often missexed at birth. And activists will use these cases as this justification that, we don't really know anybody's sex when, at birth. So they're just sort of arbitrarily assigned based on glancing at someone's genitals, even though that may not be true. And, in these very rare cases, that is true. But then to try to apply those rare cases to like the general category of everyone, like most trans individuals aren't intersex, for one. So these arguments don't apply to them. For the vast majority of trans people, there's no question of what their sex is. They're clearly one sex or the other. They just happen to identify as a different sex. But it's sort of, I think the language they use is sort of a way to sort of implicate doctors or the medical system in this system that something had happened to them. It was they've been misclassified or in some way, which doesn't make any sense when you think about it, just because doctors aren't assigning genders to individuals, which are like sort of sex roles or things like that. They're just basically looking at the genitals, and with almost 99.9% accuracy, that's going to be the correct assignment. Later in life, that might not turn out to be not true, but for most people it is. And if it does get messed up, then that's usually pretty evident down the road at some point, so that can be corrected. So yeah, it's the language game that makes it seem like sex is some ambiguous thing that's just sort of arbitrary. Yeah, kind of what they do.
Mm-hmm. And if you say this, you will get castigated as a bigot. So these activists, these activists who don't want us to point out any of these facts, what has your experience been like with the activists?
They've been pretty aggressive, to put it mildly. I mean, some of the essays I've written get really large backlash. I've had to block so many people who just post the craziest vile towards me, or they'll start tweeting at, when I used to work at Penn State as a postdoc, they would start tweeting at Penn State saying, do you have this bigot who's doing research at your university? I've had people post on job boards, one of the biggest job boards in my field. It's called the Evo Jobs Wiki, and during the whole hiring season, there's thousands of scientists in my exact field go there every day, and someone just uploaded a job that just said Colin Wright is a transphobe and a race scientist. They just threw in race scientist just because, just as a cherry on top, even though I don't really talk about race, but why not? He's racist too. So it's just this all-in tactic to try to smear someone they don't like, who's saying things they don't like at all costs, even though they'll just make up claims like he's a race scientist or something. So that was my experience. I've had people go to the diversity officers at Penn State, and they said that my Wall Street Journal article was an attack on non-binary identities, and that they felt unsafe on campus, knowing that I'm there, or something, as if I was a bug biologist. I was studying ant behavior, as if I'm going to be like jumping out of the bushes and attacking people because they're trans or non-binary or something. I don't know what they thought. But that's sort of what you can expect if you're an academic and you don't happen to buy into some of these arguments about the sex spectrum or some of the nuances of gender ideology. You can expect to be attacked pretty hard.
Yeah, I also have been called racist just for basically saying that I don't believe trans women are women. So that gets thrown around a lot. And there's also this idea that it's white supremacy to acknowledge the differences between the sexes.
Yeah. Everything, they'll have a racist argument for everything. I mean, I've criticized the rulings on Castor Semenya being allowed to compete with females, and then I'm immediately called a racist because Semenya is a Black woman, and they immediately say there'll be some article in Scientific American or something that'll just be like the racist history of biological sex or something like that. It's almost like a fill in the blank Mad Lib where you can just like make up the titles, and it's just like, no, this has nothing to do with anyone's race here. This is purely just biological sex driven. But yeah, they're pretty ruthless in what they'll just throw at you to try to whatever sticks is fine with them, as long as you shut up.
Yeah, and so they did these awful things. They posted this on the job board. They were essentially trying to get you blacklisted from academia. What you ended up leaving academia. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I had to think pretty long and hard about it. I talked to a lot of my mentors and a lot of other scientists who both agreed and didn't agree with me, and I didn't get really any. I got a few like job interviews, just a phone interview. I got, I think, 3 total phone interviews, which isn't very much. And maybe I'm just a terrible scientist or something. But my CV was pretty good for my career stage, so I thought I would have had more. And then I had friends tell me that a lot of it might be because of the articles that I'm publishing, and it's a radioactive topic. And I actually spoke to the chair of a biology department at a college in Nebraska. I won't out him who it was, but he had read a lot of my articles and he liked the stuff I wrote. And him and people on the faculty there, he said that they would really like to offer me a job there, but he said that almost guaranteed that the HR would block the hiring if they tried to, just because it would be considered too risky in some sense, because they just, you get a bunch of kids saying that, they feel unsafe and they just want to avoid any sort of controversy. So it would just be much easier just to go to the next person on the list of, who they're going to offer a job to. So I just sort of saw all these signals, all these cues that if I were to want to double down and really go into academia and try to dodge this minefield of accusations, it's going to be so much more difficult for me. And even if I do get an offer for a tenure track job, which would be really difficult, given the controversy around a lot of the stuff I wrote, I'd have to then wait 6 years to get tenure, and I'm still going to be outspoken about the things that I care about. Like that's not something I was going to compromise on. And it's not going to look good on a tenure package if you have every year students are claiming that you're invalidating their identities or they feel personally attacked. And so I just sort of thought long and hard and figured that I didn't feel like my future was really in my control. I could work as hard as I can and publish papers in the best journals, and I wasn't convinced or confident that would actually result in a job or tenure or anything like that. I wanted to get my future out of the hands of, hiring committees and tenure committees. So I decided to leave academia so I could basically try to pursue some lines of work that would, that I would be not able to be canceled from, for one, and that I could speak freely on issues I thought were important, and that I'd have more control over my success. I could be more confident that my hard work, whatever it happened to be in, was going to result in at least something, at least more probable than in academia anyway.
It strikes me as an indication of how religious this movement is, that it cannot tolerate someone having a different stance. I mean, I hesitate to even call it a different opinion, because I think what you're saying is rooted in science and reality, and this ideology is not. So how do you see that they've gotten all this power? I mean, how do they have the power to do this? Like, they got me fired. Someone tweeted at my agency saying, this transphobic bigot, don't go anywhere near her. And they've tried to do the same thing to you. So how did they gain this foothold, in your view?
I mean, it has to do with just how extreme they are, how quickly they come at anyone who doesn't completely toe the line. And it's, there's not like a first accusation that's, just like, maybe you shouldn't say that. It just goes immediately to 10, where they're just, you're a bigot, transphobe, racist person. And these are some of the worst things you can call people, especially publicly. Nobody looks good defending themselves and saying like, no, actually, I'm not racist. Like, that just doesn't look good. Once someone accuses someone of being racist or something, the burden of proof somehow shifts to that person who's accused to just prove that they're not racist, rather than having someone actually demonstrate that you are, which should be the case. And so this just causes people to be quiet. It's a major chilling effect, because people rightfully look around and they see that the individuals who did speak up, they got completely hammered immediately by a mob of people. And that's the biggest problem. It keeps people from speaking up. You mentioned sort of the religious aspect of it, and I think it's really a good analogy because in most articles I write, well, I say all the articles I write, I really try to strike a balance in tone. I don't want to be condescending. I try to be, I don't try to, use, kid gloves too much when I talk about it. I just try to give the facts, and I try not to say anything, like I don't take swipes at people. But I get people telling me that I just sound like I'm such an asshole, and I'm so aggressive in these articles. And I just remember back when I used to watch Richard Dawkins, and they always told him that, he's so strident when he talks about religion, and why are you so strident? And his response was, I thought, really good. He's like, well, he's not actually that strident. He's just speaking plainly about something that is basically this sacrosanct belief that they have, where any criticism sounds aggressive because it's just so used to being this taboo to talk about these things. So I can just make a plain argument about why sex is not a spectrum, and people will take offense. It'll sound aggressive, even though I'm just laying out like a linear argument. Same way if you talk about why like Noah's flood didn't happen, you're going to anger a young earth creationist. They're going to say you're attacking them or something. So I think that's sort of what's going on in both fields. They see any attack, any attempt to argue against their position is interpreted as just being beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you did mention that when you would argue with creationists, they didn't necessarily call you a bigot; they just said you're wrong.
Yeah.
And that this new movement has something else that, and as you described, that calling someone a bigot, or racist, or whatever is, or phobic, is so effective. And I mean, do you see this particular movement as having one that was similar in history? Is it like the Inquisition, or is there anything that you'd compare it to in particular, another sort of anti-scientific movement?
I mean, I guess the closest would be sort of the Maoist cultural revolution in some way. I mean, you get the science denialism that's cropping up. You get sort of these strains of, we can talk about like Lysenkoism, where you have these bad ideas about growing crops that are then just sort of taken as fact because, the other ideas are considered to be, capitalist, or, just not part of the ideology. I think some good comparisons to sort of Mao's China, it sounds hyperbole, but I mean, it maybe is a little bit right now, but, you never know where these things can go, is the sort of mutual policing that's going on in academia, in these communities. When I left academia, I had a really close friend, someone who's I've been in the lab with before. He was another grad student with me. We were extremely good friends. We've published articles together, and he saw that I'm as I was getting more followers, more, I guess, popularity on Twitter or something, and people were looking, and they realized that my name was on papers that he had also authored, and they were pressuring him to make a statement about me because and these are papers that are on spider behavior. Okay, this is completely divorced, and these are just the most boring papers you'll read if you're just not interested in spider behavior. Completely innocuous papers, just like spider personalities predict something in the colonies. And just because my name was on these papers with him in the same line, people were telling him that he needed to, do you agree with Colin? Do you support what he does? So he sent me a text message one morning that just said that, like, hey man, I'm sort of getting pressure from colleagues, and I was ignoring it for a while, but it's sort of ramping up, and people are accusing me of maybe agreeing with you on these. So he needed to make a Twitter post. He said he needed to denounce my views on Twitter just publicly, just so he could distance himself from me completely. And so he's worried about just the splash damage of having co-authored a paper with me on his career. And he didn't feel like he needed originally to say anything about it, but because his colleagues and stuff were pressuring him to make some sort of statement, it got to the point where he felt he had to just denounce me completely. And that's what he did. He went online and does it. And he's also someone who denies cancel culture is real, even though it's just like, well, they pressured you to do it. And if you're worried about the splash damage from the words I'm saying, like, do you realize I'm getting like the direct fire hose? Like, you're getting the droplets, but I'm getting hosed completely for these ideas. I just don't know how he can't see what's going on. But that whole mutual policing, that's just very much that sort of Chinese Cultural Revolution, where pressure your colleagues to say the right thing.
Yeah, and I mean, he had basically the opposite reaction to you, because you were told, don't talk about this, don't touch this topic, because you'll upset people. And so you leaned into it, which I think is admirable, and we need more people to do that. And then he did sort of what's probably the more common thing to do, which is given to the mob, and that's the power of the mob.
Yeah. It's unclear to me if he believes what he says. I mean, I'm not going to try to read his mind. He claims that sex is a spectrum and all that stuff. I don't see how he can possibly believe that, because I know him so well. But I'll take him at his word. He believes that sex is a spectrum, and that's fine. And I don't care about being called out on Twitter. If he wanted to make a post of like, here's why Colin Wright is wrong, like, that's fine with me. But the problem is that he felt pressured to do it. That's not something he wanted to just do on his own. Like he felt he had to save his career to some degree.
Right. Is anybody saying, here's why Colin Wright is wrong? Is there any actual engagement on the topics?
That's the biggest thing, is that in all the articles I've written, so when I wrote my Wall Street Journal article, I did get a few groups reach out, and one of them was an LGBT group, and they realized that the tone we struck, and the fact that we don't, we're not right-wing person. I'm on the left. That's what I thought I was. And yeah. They told me that, they realized, this wasn't an offensive article, and that they liked our tone, and they were interested in some sort of dialogue, and that they were going to issue a response. That just never came. I had a lot of people say that they were going to pen a response to it, and they never showed up, or if they did, they've never been sent my way. And I try to Google sort of responses to our articles, and I've just never seen anything that resembles a coherent response to any of the articles. One person sort of wrote something on her personal blog, but it just started out on about biological sex, and it immediately switched to gender identity, and then it just went down that route. And I was like, well, I'm not talking about that. Like, I'm just talking about biological sex. So a lot of times they'll just make that change. They'll be like biology, identity, and then the whole rest of the argument is just, they just start riffing on gender ideology, which is not something I'm concerned with. I'm interested in the biology part. That's what I know well, so that's what I stick to.
Right. And science, one of its core principles is to hold up each idea, to scrutinize it, to prove it wrong, right? I mean, that is that not the complete opposite of what they're doing? And it's so it's like such a dogma, because they don't want any of their ideas to be examined, and they don't want to engage with any of your ideas. But how does that, because that really strikes me, that science is all about proving the old ideas wrong and thinking of new ideas, and you're not supposed to have an attachment to a theory or idea on an emotional level. So
yeah, somehow activists have just managed to link these ideas to ideas of morality and the social justice ideas, and that if you criticize gender ideology, you're a bigot. If you criticize, it's not even on this whole sex thing. If you criticize a movement like maybe Black Lives Matter or something, you can, I mean, everyone would agree that like Black Lives Matter, but you can disagree with like the specific tenets of a movement and what they say. But it's all part of the language game too, where they'll have these cleverly worded things where you say, I disagree with that, and then they say, you disagree with the general claim that I'm saying here. And so yeah, they've managed to shield their ideas and beliefs in ways that when you voice disagreement, it just automatically puts you in a category as a bigot, at least in their minds or something. And then it's also not clear how much a lot of them actually believe it, and who are just going along with it because they don't want to be targeted as well. Yeah, it's amazing that they've actually, how far this has gotten in so many institutions.
Yeah, it is. And going back to Caster Semenya, which I think is a super interesting case, because I didn't really know anything about Caster Semenya until the recent ruling that I think said she's not eligible to compete with women.
Yeah.
And at that time I thought, oh, that sounds up. Like, I think she's a woman and she should be allowed to compete just because she doesn't look feminine. that they're saying that she's not a woman. That seems wrong. That's what I thought, not knowing much about it. And that's what I think most people think about this. And when you go on Twitter, you just see like comment after comment saying, how dare you say she's not a woman? But then I actually read into it a little bit, and Caster Semenya, as you said, has a condition where she's not really female. I mean, is that correct to say? I know she's socially a woman, but
Yeah.
why? So, and then in all of the articles about her, they're not saying this. So
yeah, it's all part of the language game too. I mean, because the activists will either say that sex and gender are different or the same, depending on what claim they're trying to further. Sometimes they'll conflate them. Sometimes they'll say they're different. So they'll say that Caster Semenya is a woman, and to them, woman is like a gender identity. And so if we agree with that, then yeah, then Caster Semenya is a woman. But there's other ways to conceive of what a woman is, and a lot of people think that woman is inherently linked to your biological sex, and that a woman is an adult human female. And we have, so it needs to go back to like, why do we have segregated sports in the first place? Are they segregated based on how people subjectively feel about themselves? Well, no, because that's so stupid. Like, this is why we don't have leagues for Republicans and Democrats, because your identity, political or whatever, has nothing to do with your ability to run or lift weights or anything like that. So, okay, the normative argument for sex segregated sports is because it's related to your actual biological sex. So the fact that Semenya is identifies as a woman doesn't mean that she should be able to compete with females. She has XY chromosomes. People with Caster Semenya's condition have fathered children before. And then when you look at the people who placed first, second, and third in the Rio Olympics, and I think it was either the 400 or the 800, all three of them had the same condition as Caster. They were all the first, second, third place people, gold, silver, and bronze, all were 46XY individuals that had clear signs of testosterone. That they looked more virilized, more masculine features. It absolutely is contributing to their ability to outperform females, and that's just either female sports is a protected category that has rules for who can get in and get out, or it's just a free for all, and then you don't have female sports. So we need to choose which one of these that we want to uphold.
Right. And so they're basically, people are saying like, well, these are women with naturally occurring higher levels of testosterone, right? But they omit to mention the reason why. I mean, is because they were born with testes, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Do you think that part of this idea maybe it completely came from feminism, but do you think it came from feminism that you're not supposed to talk about the differences between men and women, because in reality some of the differences disadvantage women, and so you're not supposed to say like women aren't as strong? And I was just watching a clip from the movie She's the Man. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, Amanda Bynes was told that she couldn't ever beat the boys at soccer, so then of course she pretends to be a boy and proves them wrong. So there was this like girl power feminism. I mean, I've always considered myself a feminist, but the mainstream modern feminism is rife with all these weird problems and implications. So do you think that maybe part of this came from that it was considered sexist to point out those differences?
Yeah, I think a big problem is that a lot of people seem to think it's justified to attach sort of a moral claim or attach value to just basic statements of fact. Like, I can say that males and females differ in their average height. No one's going to accuse me of being sexist for just pointing out that. But if you say, that males and females also differ on average in the types of careers that they want to pursue, or, in how, it shouldn't be really controversial in sports, even though it is, because, their bodies are different. But they tend to try to just add this moral claim to it, where if you say that females are different, or if they're not as high in some trait as males and whatever it might be, that they're somehow lesser human, that they're somehow inferior in some way. And this is just, these need to be separated out completely. We can make factual statements about average differences between certain groups of people and still acknowledge that there's plenty of overlap in these groups too. You know, like just if I say that men are taller than women, I'm not saying that all men are taller than all women. Like there's some women who are taller than men and vice versa. But if you go to the extremes, you know, what are the proportion of people that are over 7 feet tall? It's almost all going to be males up there. And so, yeah, it comes down to this conflation of basic statements of fact with a moral statement of value and worth. And they just have no business being conflated with each other. We need to be able to talk about facts void of values in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you had any academics sort of stand by you or speak up about this as well?
None in my personal life. So my advisors and mentors that told me that they advised me not to publish these things, they've been very supportive, and I speak to at least one of them pretty regularly, and they're thrilled about what I'm doing. They're Quillette readers, so he's excited that I'm now working there and stuff. So yeah, they've been really supportive. But most of the people I've worked with and collaborated when I was in academia have all turned against me in a very, very strong way. So yeah, there's that.
What do you think that culture is like in the academy right now? I mean, are they in fear? What are they even thinking? Just repeating these mantras? Like, are they afraid of the mob? You said like you're not even sure if they believe it, and I see that too. You know, my boss, I'm not even sure if he believed that. Well, he actually said that he didn't think what I wrote was hateful, but that it quote unquote invalidated trans identities. So I mean, yeah, there's an element of people not even believing very strongly in condemning us based on our ideas, but they want to go along with the mob. But what is it like for people in academia right now?
Yeah, I mean, what it was like for me, it was very just completely stressful because I wanted to do my own science too, but I felt it was hard to reach out to people I collaborated with before because I would see what they would say on social media about me and how I was this horrible bigot. And it's like, well, do they still want to be on that paper with me? Like, I don't know what to do. And, you know, it's almost impossible for me to want to reach out to new collaborators because in some way, like, if they've seen what I've written on things, I don't know if they're immediately going to denounce me. Or, you know, I got worried that if I went to conferences and were to give a talk on wasps or spider behavior, are there going to be protesters showing up? So it was just this huge, I had so much anxiety when I was in academia, just based on the cues and signals I was getting from a lot of, not even people I didn't know, but people that I knew really well over the years who knew that I was not a bigot just based on their interactions with me, who now all of a sudden were convinced that I was. So, you know, if people I've spent so much time with who know me really well can be so easily convinced that I'm a bigot, well, then like strangers are clearly not going to give me the benefit of the doubt. So yeah, I think a lot of them are true believers, as sad as that is and scary. But yeah, that's sort of the environment right now. It might be different from university to university, but at least the ones I've been to, you know, I started grad school at the University of Pittsburgh. It was pretty woke. Then I finished my PhD at the University of UC Santa Barbara in California, and that was even worse. So, yeah, it's not a good sign of things to come.
Hmm. What would you say to people in academia, whether they're scientists or in other fields, and they are thinking dissident thoughts, you know, forbidden thoughts? What would you say to them? Would you advise them to follow the same path as you and speak up?
It's really going to depend on the individual circumstances that someone has. I do get a lot of emails from professors and postdocs and grad students and even undergrads who were thinking about going into academia but are now second guessing it because they might not even, you know, they're not even right wing. They're sort of like me too. They might be, you know, left leaning, but not into a lot of the gender ideology stuff. And they're just concerned that they're going to get canceled or something. And I would say if unless you plan on being super outspoken on social media or writing articles in Quillette or something, you're probably okay in going into academia. You know, if you just if you're more concerned with just doing good science, you'll probably be okay doing that if you don't feel the need to just be really public about your views. But then, you know, I'm always going to advocate people to speak up on their principles and be someone who's going to be bold. But you need to take into account, you know, your circumstances too. I probably wouldn't have spoken up if I had, you know, 3 kids or something and to take care of, and I was the main breadwinner. That would be some environmental factor that might keep me quiet longer. I don't have any kids. I'm not married or anything, so I had a lot more freedom. You know, only person who I could let down is myself in a way. So yeah, so I had some more freedom to do it, but I think some people should at least do what they can, whatever that might be. You know, if it's showing up to teacher meetings and being on the heads of faculty boards of, you know, things that are, the meetings are actually deciding things that happen in the department, do that, ask questions, try to insert yourself in these positions of power, because that's what the activists are doing. That's what they're really good at. They're just super busybodies, always trying to do, they're always the ones who are voting and showing up to those meetings. So you can do what you can by trying to, you know, push back on the ideas there, maybe just asking questions to expose them, and then just voting and, you know, trying to do your best without, you know, exposing yourself as, you know, this horrific person that they think you are.
Yeah. Asking questions is a great way because it can reveal to onlookers and people listening that the stuff really doesn't make any sense.
I'm sure there's a lot of people in like a lot of the rooms who, if someone were to just speak up and ask questions like, this just seems kind of regressive and we're talking about stereotypes of masculinity, you know, if they just were to do that, there's probably a lot of people in the room who would just be like, yeah, I'm thinking that same thing, but I don't want to say anything. So there's ways to sort of bridge this. You know, I think Helen Pluckrose had an article about it where, you know, she mentions just, you know, ask questions, play dumb too. Just be like, can you really just spell this out for me, what you really mean by this? And a lot of times if you give them a long enough rope, you know, they'll hang themselves with it sometimes. At least to a lot of people in the room who are paying close attention.
Right. And you did allude to the internal contradictions, which I think, like any religion, it's full of internal contradictions, and that can get revealed when you ask for definitions and things like that. And now, have you heard about this Jodi Shaw? She is of Smith College, and she just started making these videos kind of highlighting what she sees as racial bias in terms of the woke racial sensitivity training and everything. And she's talking about how she thinks there's an environment now of really judging people based on their race. Do you think that there's any kind of a shift coming, or how do you see this going forward?
I do think there's a shift. People are talking about it more, definitely. I think one of the best things that Trump did, and I always have to say this, I don't consider myself a Trump supporter. I didn't vote for Trump. I voted for Tulsi Gabbard. That shouldn't matter, but it does. Is that, you know, even though I don't think Trump will be very effective in getting rid of critical race theory from the government, I'm just so glad that it was called out by name. So now people can see this problem and it was publicized and a lot of people are talking about it. So at least it started the conversation on this ideology. I don't think Trump's going to be the best person to take that across the finish line. I think he's too toxic. No one's going to, he's just going to ruin everything. But I think now that, you know, if he is no longer the president, which it looks like he might not be, but we'll see. I don't want to jinx it. At least we have the conversation started right now. And now people, since, you know, are hopefully going to be able to make these arguments without being accused of being a, you know, a complete, you know, Trump supporter and all this stuff. And yeah, I mean, that's my hope, is just to start this conversation more and keep having it and keep pushing back against it. And more people do seem to be standing up. And frankly, most people who I see making these videos, I can't remember the woman's name you just mentioned, but yeah, I mean, that's super brave to do that, because they're going to come after her almost certainly. But these are usually people who are, you know, they're liberal people. They're on the left who are just sort of sick of this this ideology. And I think it takes more and more people just like her standing up for what they think of, like the stuff that you did as well. The more and more people that come forward and talk about it, it kind of provides shade and oxygen for other people to sort of feel like they're not the only ones out there and that they might be okay.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, I do think we have a silent majority in that case, which is it's encouraging, but it's also, it's hard because everyone seems to speak up one at a time, and that's why it's easy to take them out. If you just need to reach some sort of critical mass where everyone just is all at once feels all of a sudden more comfortable saying, nope, this is unacceptable. Here's why. You're not going to cancel. You can't cancel half of the population. So
Right.
at least we'll see.
Yeah. Another one who's I'm hoping will speak out a little more, but has started to, is Glenn Greenwald, and he went on the Joe Rogan show, and they had this really interesting conversation, and they did talk about gender identity ideology and how it's regressive and it's anti-scientific.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that whole interview. I saw bits and pieces. I didn't know they talked about that though.
Yeah, they talk about it about like an hour and a half in.
Okay,
And
cool.
it's really exciting to hear. But the whole interview is really interesting about Edward Snowden and how he had the courage of his convictions. And Glenn Greenwald had this really powerful comment about how Snowden can sleep so easily at night because of what he did. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, who are some of the people that you get your news from or your analysis? Who do you recommend that we listen to or read?
Ooh. I'm a big fan of Heather Heying. I think she's just one of the most reasonable people. And even if, people don't agree with her on things, that at least she's like a model behavior for how to conduct yourself in public on things, on these issues. You're talking about specifically like people about in the area of biological sex or gender issues or
it could be, or just anything really in terms of politics, society, anything.
Yeah. I am a big, huge fan of Helen Pluckrose. I think she is model behavior in how she approaches people online. I like what James Lindsay does, although he's a little more aggressive on Twitter and he can put some people off. But if you can get past that, then it's his content is excellent. I'm a big fan of Kathleen Stock on sort of the whole gender ideology thing. She's very articulate when she speaks against that. Helen Joyce is fantastic. She's got a book coming out on sort of gender identity ideology. Abigail Schreier is fantastic on this. Her book Irreversible Damage is excellent. I'm sure there's so many people that I'm leaving out of this whole thing.
Yeah, but no, those were some good ones to start with.
They're all fantastic. I'm a big fan of Sam Harris in the past. He hasn't been in the culture wars in a big way in the last several years, but I'm hoping he'll jump back into that at some point. But
yeah, as you're saying, as more people start to speak, hopefully we'll reach some critical mass and the tide will turn.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's so many really great articulate voices out there that we just don't know about because they're still like not saying anything. So I think hopefully we'll see more people start speaking up about it, and we'll have even more individuals who get canceled and start their own podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. The abusive tactics don't work as well when more people just ignore them and say it anyway.
Yeah, I say one thing about like the whole mobs, woke mobs, is when they're really good at finding the really bold free thinkers that I gravitate towards. So they're good at sniffing out individuals that I find extremely interesting. So that's actually a good silver lining is like, oh, you found one.
Right. When you see a call out post, you can, there's someone to follow.
It's just, someone who's very interesting, I'm sure, because if they, or at least, a bold intellectual that even if I disagree with, I'd like to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Colin. This was really interesting. Thanks for joining me.
Oh yeah. Awesome. Thank you for having me on.